Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Points of View. We hope that your first week back in the spring term hasn't been too difficult. So the first article that we're going to be discussing today is the BBC reporting that staff at 2 primary schools in Greater Manchester have gone on strike over claims their reports of violence and daily assaults are being ignored by senior leadership. So teachers at 2 primary schools have walked out following claims that pupils have been biting and kicking staff, throwing furniture, and at one of them bringing knives to school. One of the teachers told the BBC nothing is being done to protect children or staff, and members of teachers' unions are set to strike 3 days a week throughout January. Anyone want to go first?
Well, I mean, there was an interview on LBC about this this week. I didn't get to see it all, but what struck me about the article that we read was that teachers are at breaking point, that they felt as though they were being ignored, that they weren't being supported in any way. I think what they said was they were treated with contempt and neglect by their seniority in the school. There was a young teacher who had started work there. He had experience, but it was his first term there, and he left after a term because he thought being a new person, he might make a difference, and he didn't. It just continued. He was physically attacked. He left after a term, and I think the most striking thing was that he hasn't gone back into teaching yet. He will do, but not yet. And I think that's really damning. That really shows just how traumatic it must have been. There are other teachers who are saying that they feel that they can't leave because they need the money, mortgage, family, that kind of thing. So they're trapped there, but in an unhappy situation, working-wise. The biggest shock was that in the LBC interview, I heard that apparently parents at the school had no idea about this. This has come as a complete shock to them. They weren't aware of any of this. So it seems a bit, it seems as though there's more to learn on this, I think. I just wonder what striking is intended to achieve, because normally you're looking for a measurable outcome when you strike. You want better conditions, you want better pay, things like that. But with this strike, I don't know whether they're looking for certain pupils to be excluded, whether they're looking for the senior leadership to change or step down or what. So I'm not really sure, and I didn't get a feel for that in the article that we read, of what the aim is, because it's 9 days. That's a lot of time, and the school will remain open, but obviously alternative arrangements will have to be made for classes, and strain will be put on other teachers. So I would really like to know what striking will achieve, because unless there's something that can be, that there's a clear, not a demand, but for want of a better word, unless there's a clear demand of what the change is that they want to see, then I don't know what you'll get from it, really.
Yeah, that was my main question as well. What are the demands? What do they want? Is it a change in the behavior policy? Is it leadership to step down? What is this hoping to achieve? Strikes can be really powerful. Sorry, Yasmin. Strikes can be really, really powerful, but you need to know exactly what the actual aim is. Otherwise, it's just confusing. Go on, sorry.
Maybe it's just not been made public. Maybe it's, under negotiation. I think it makes complete sense to strike, because at the very least, do you know what I mean? Teachers are so valuable. They make such a difference every day. You've got people making the conscious choice to come in to teach every day. And, they were described in the article as not feeling like they were teaching. Well, the one teacher that was quoted, the teacher that left, said that they came prepared to teach, but just felt like they were managing a bad situation. I think they said something like that. And I just think unions exist to protect teachers. And so if you're facing abuse every day, then it does make sense to go on strike, because then at least something will change, even if it isn't clear what will change. You're doing it because the current situation you're in is really damaging to your safety and well-being as a teacher. That's just what I thought.
But the only thing is, you see, this is 9 days, and if nothing changes, what next? You know, how long will this go on for? Like you said, it could be under negotiation. It could be something that, you know, the staff have made leadership aware of. But if there isn't a sort of an outcome achieved, if people say, no, we're not going to step down, if that's the demand, where does it go? How long will this continue for?
Yeah, I can't imagine that people will be pushing for senior leadership to step down. I think it's more to just be listened to. I couldn't imagine off the back of a strike, SLT being like, you know what, guys, I'm just going to leave now. I just don't ever see that happening. Like, I just feel like it's more. The thing I actually was really interested in was, did it say how many teachers? Because I was interested in the fact that it was the NASUWT. Nazwit. I never really know how to pronounce it, but
The long one.
Yeah, the long one. Am I right to assume that NEU has more members?
Yes.
Or have I just made that up?
No, you're correct.
Most people I know are in the
But
NEU.
not in every school. Like there are some schools that have. It's kind of the reverse.
And also
situation.
Support staff. I think typically more of them are members of the NASUWT. I think. I'm not sure. I genuinely might have just made this up, but that's just kind of that's always been my perception. So I was interested that it was that particular union. So was there any indication as to how many members it was, or how many teachers are on strike? Imagine if it's a situation where most of the teachers in the school are part of the NEU and they're still there.
Which is surprising. Too. I don't know why. I feel like I read that it certainly isn't all of the staff. And I think it was just 2. I'm just going to go back and see if I can find it.
Because it's surprising that it's that union. I mean, if we're talking about track records, but also general stereotypes, the NEU strike far more. They always they're more likely
I used to be an NEU rep. I was across different schools actually, and I remember a time when I first became a rep. Sorry, this is so irrelevant. I don't know why I brought it up, but I was a rep. I remember I was planning my first ever meeting. I was really early in my career. I was planning my first ever union meeting, and the head teacher basically said he wasn't available for a meeting that day, the day that I'd proposed. I was a teacher on a full timetable, so and all my PPAs were either, most of my PPAs were actually on a Friday afternoon, which I know most people would hate, but I loved it. But anyway, that's also irrelevant. He said he wasn't available, so I just went back to the regional rep for the borough, and I told them, and they were like, "No, you're a stakeholder on this table, and you need to demand that the head teacher make himself free for this meeting." And I just remember being a bit I just remember being aware, very acutely aware, that the union were very maybe militant isn't the right word, but it was just very. A lot of the time they were pushing, not at my school in particular necessarily, but a lot of the time when I was a union rep, my experience in the NEU was pushing for strikes, pushing for these things. That's what I'd be advised to do. And there were loads of schools in the local borough that I was in at the time that would have strikes. There's currently a school in the borough that's on strike, I think because of timetable increases. And having less PPA than they used to and now a new head teacher. So, I was surprised that it was only one union and not another. And I think as well, sometimes unions are really good at working together. If there is something raised about a school in one union, it's usually been raised by members of other unions as well. And they often work collectively to plan something. So I just was really interested in how come I could only find things on one union, and also how come parents were completely unaware of it. And I'm not asking that to trivialize what's happened, but I was really curious as to how this has kind of come about.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get to watch all of the LBC interview because we came back online and I didn't get to see it all, but that was up until that point, that was the clip that I'd seen where it had come as a surprise to parents, and where I got the idea it might be 2 teachers, it's 2 schools, and so it kept talking about both, and I think that's where I got the idea. So it doesn't say how many teachers there are. It could be, I don't know really much about unions. I wasn't involved in them at school, but maybe all of the teachers, I mean, the fact that schools are staying open suggests that they have enough staff left behind to meet the needs. So it can't be all of the teachers that had just happened to be members of that particular union. But I suppose imagining that, you had a mixed membership of different unions, that may be the only one that responded and gave advice to strike.
I think, sorry, but I just sometimes feel like unions really let down teachers. Like, I don't know, like there's a lot I love about unions. I will always be a member of a union, and I'm always happy to put myself forward as a union rep in any school that I'm in. I think, they're there to protect teachers, and I do always care about the staff that I'm working with, and I care about my own well-being, etc. And I feel like there are many different ways in which you can work collaboratively with a school leadership team to just be, a facilitator between what the staff are saying and the senior leadership team, or like the management, without it necessarily having to be, antagonistic or like difficult or any of those kinds of things. Like I feel like there is a way that they can, coexist and it be a really good thing in a school. But I just sometimes, my experience is when I've seen it a lot, like because I won a tribunal so early in my career, I've had to share so much of my teaching career with hearing about other people's really difficult experiences. Because mine was so public, I've always been so open about it. And I've always been willing to listen to or help any teachers that get in touch with me from all sorts of schools and places, and offer them advice or help, or just even be someone, like just a listening ear if they need it. I think a common thread has often been for me that people feel quite, on an individual level, feel quite neglected by unions. I think a lot of the time when I've seen people face abuse in schools, the unions often just advise them to raise it with the senior leadership team, or say that there isn't much that they can do to help. And I know that it's left a lot of teachers feeling quite disillusioned. I also know people who, I mean, I'm no expert in the law, but people whose experiences to me sound very discriminatory. And, they'll be told that it's got no legal prospects of like success, that it's not something that they're going to win or take up. And sometimes they're even guilt tripped and told to think about the fact that they're wasting members' money if they want to proceed with things. And, I think in teaching, there's this huge kind of NDA culture where we really push for teachers to just, in exchange for like a reference or a little bit of money, just sign away their negative experiences or their trauma, or just things that are like, not everything is necessarily trauma, but things that are unresolved. And then they then go on to other schools, or sometimes even leave the profession, and they're carrying a lot of these experiences that they never got any kind of closure for.
I'm so sorry. I want to interrupt because I just wanted to talk to you about our partners. So Hachette Learning, this show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development, books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit www.hachetteLearning to explore a full range of titles. And then there's one about the BET show. So join BET for the biggest week in education from the 21st to the 23rd of January 2026 in the Excel London, with immersive workshops, thought-provoking speakers, hundreds of hours of CPD accredited content, cutting-edge technology and unrivaled networking. There is no opportunity quite like it for educators. Get your free ticket today by visiting ukbetshow.com. And then we've got the Teachers Talk Connect. So Talk Connect is back, our annual CPD and networking extravaganza. Join the TTR team on Saturday the 14th of March in Manchester. Tickets are free. What are you waiting for? Head over to ttradio.org/connect 2026. Thank you. Sorry, you can carry on with that discussion.
So obviously I don't want to make this about myself, but it did just remind me, even when when I was going through my tribunal, I didn't actually want to have a tribunal. And my main reasoning for it wasn't even like, oh, this is going to take a really long time. It was more that I actually just didn't want to be on bad terms with the school. I didn't want to be in a position where I had to say anything negative about a top performing school. I told the head teacher, like I tried to resign. I told him face to face. I just said, look, I know there's loads of great things about the school. I know that loads of children go here. I don't really want to impact the school's reputation or any of those things. I'd just rather quietly leave and just, continue my career elsewhere. So can you, accept my resignation? That's what I wanted. And, things got really bad. And eventually the NEU, I was able to get them involved, and they were pushing for the head teacher to just give me a reference and a really small payout. I think it was like 2 months pay. And considering I was in my first year of teaching, it was either a month or 2 months pay, which is really nothing when you're like a main scale teacher who's just trying to go. And he almost kind of like laughed and was like, and just said no. And then later on, when I did end up going through the tribunal, after like years, when we were eventually going to court, all of a sudden I'm now getting offered payouts in exchange for an NDA. And I said no. At this point, like, I've already suffered anyway. Like, I'd rather lose in court than have to, sign this NDA. And I remember the NEU turning around and saying, well, you're wasting members' money, and they dropped my case. And like, I remember that, and a lot happened, and I don't really want to like get into it, but that was my experience. And then I remember watching YouTube tutorials after school. I went back into teaching, and I'd spend all my time after school and on weekends watching YouTube tutorials about how to represent yourself in court, because I thought, oh, what now? Like, the NEU's ditched me. So, they ended up picking my case back up maybe 2 or 3 nights before I went to trial. But it was really difficult. Like, it was really, really hard. And so many people I know have that experience with unions, where, especially if you raise something as an individual, sometimes you just don't get the help that you need, and people feel disillusioned and think, well, I've been paying this membership for years. Every teacher that I meet that talks about being part of a union always says, I'm part of a union just in case, just in case something happens to me. Like, teachers live in fear. They genuinely live in fear. And what happens is it's kind of like this catch-22, where if you've only got your own unique experiences, sometimes, you just kind of fall through the gaps and it doesn't really get anywhere. But then when you've got a collective experience, like, you're almost encouraged to kind of gather people and turn into a bit of a, like a large group that sometimes people do refer to as a mob or vexatious and things like that, because sometimes it's the only way that you can be heard.
Yeah, this is what I found interesting. Like, you said it so correctly. We live in fear. And I think everyone's number one reason for being part of a union is to have some sort of support if your school turns on you, or if an allegation is made, or if something, goes horribly, horribly wrong, which does happen on a regular basis. Like, we are in such a vulnerable position, and we need to have some sort of support, some sort of backing. And but the thing that gets me though, right? I understand why unions can be so forceful. And I think people who are less inclined to strike, like, I think we should strike more. I think we should strike over everything. I think we should strike over more than just waiting till it comes down to like teachers complaining about pay, or there's a change in conditions or whatever. Like, I want to be striking about buildings falling apart. I want to be striking about our SEN kids having nowhere to go and not getting proper education. I want to be striking over the fact that there are too many kids in my classroom. Like, I want to be striking over everything. I would live on strike. I want to move to France. I want to be French. I want to strike all the time. Like, that's what I think should be happening. But people who are less inclined to take that perspective can see unions as very aggressive, or pushing people into that kind of group mentality, which is kind of what a union is. Like, you're meant to do the same thing. But then you get these people who are happy for the union to support them individually for their individual problems if they ever need them. But then they don't want to do anything with the group, or they don't want to support their union if they vote to strike, or they don't want to get involved in any sort of collective action for the benefit of the group. But they're happy to lean on the union for individual support. And the irony is, as you said, Yasmin, the union generally is pretty crap with individual support, but they will put everything into collective stuff. So the things that people actually want to get out of the union, they're not often getting out of the union. And then things that people tend to see as not as important or too extreme or going too far or whatever, that's actually what the union wants to be doing. But I just don't think they're necessarily always approaching every strike action in the right way. Or I think opinions about that.
Yeah, I think teaching at times can be, not at times, all the time, is such a thankless job that relies so heavily on goodwill. And I think unions, like striking, is one of those like contentious things where a lot of the time I think, you know, people will be critical and say, but what about, you know, the kids, or what about this, or what about supporting your school? And I think that it's a really difficult line for teachers to balance. But I just want to read something that I saw in the article. It said, to quote in the BBC article, it said, "A knife was brought into our school earlier this year, and that has not been dealt with in a way that staff feel safe to be in the building." That's basically just code for the kid didn't get excluded, right? They didn't get a exclusion. That's what they mean by that. And so I'm wondering, look, I've said for a long time, I'm not against exclusions, because I think that there are so many instances where they're necessary for the safety. Like at all times, you're balancing the well-being and safety of all of your pupils versus up against, you know, the well-being and safety of the one people or group of peoples in question in any kind of situation. You're kind of balancing the two. And I do understand that exclusions are at times necessary. And, you know, it's one of the ways of upholding the integrity of a behavior policy and culture in any school. But it did also make me wonder, I didn't have the time to go look into this, but I did wonder, has the school kind of gone through a change in behavior policies where it's been more of a move towards trauma-informed and restorative practice? Because I do believe in contextual exclusions. I think I've said that so many times on this show, maybe not in those exact words, but there are I do sometimes feel like the context behind a pupil's context and situation is important for consideration in any exclusion. But I do, in the system we currently have, I don't think that necessarily has to mean less exclusions. It can sometimes mean better reintegration or better options for that child post-permanent exclusion. Like if a child has brought a knife into school, for example, I wouldn't necessarily be critical of any school for choosing to permanently exclude that child. But I would understand also if more thought was given to their reintegration elsewhere after maybe a placement in an alternative provision. But again, that's a bit of a tangent. I think for me, I did want to, but I just didn't get the time. I did want to look into, has this school had a bit of a move where their policies have changed to be a bit more trauma-informed? Because what is the reason why a child who brought a knife into school has remained in the school? You know, I'm very interested in that. And so is it really a strike where it's being more upset about your cat is so cute? Is it more of a strike where they are against these changes in policies? Because I wouldn't say it will change my feelings towards this, but it would be important context for me to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know whether you wanted to use that, since you've sort of provided quite a nice segue into the next topic. Was there anything more we wanted to say on this story? And my feeling is that there are gaps. We don't know what the strikes are intended to achieve. That wasn't clear. We don't know how many people are involved in the strikes, how many teachers are involved in it. We don't really understand why only one of the unions has, I don't know, to use the term, mobilised teachers to strike over this issue. What's happening with the others? Could you end up with a situation where the other unions then step in at a different time and start to take the same action? So it could become quite messy. So is there anything more that we want to say, or should we move on to the next?
Just that I wish them well, honestly. It sounds sad. It sounds really sad.
Absolutely. To think that there are teachers who go to school every day in fear and that there are children in classrooms who are scared, I think that's a horrible situation. So let's hope something can be resolved, I suppose. I don't know, am I introducing the next subject?
No, it's meant to be me and my cat. So
come on, Cat.
Also for discussion, I'm trying. Also for discussion, we have an article from this week on internal exclusions, which I feel like come up every so often. Secondary schools that use internal exclusion, says Schools Week, are isolating almost a fifth of their pupils from their classmates at least once each year. And this data comes from the Key Group, which manages, which owns Arbor. So if it's like Sims or Bromcom or something, it's not in every school, but it's in a huge chunk of them. And the data from Arbor has shown that I think about 20%, in a lot of schools, about 20% of schools, children are being imprisoned, and that's in quotation marks in the article. I think that's coming from a parental report about how their children feel. They feel like they're the reject kid being imprisoned and being put in these internal seclusion rooms, sometimes for a day, sometimes for weeks on end, allegedly. What's interesting, if you look at it over time, hasn't really changed over the past couple of years. It's pretty consistent. So I think it's just that the data has been released recently. It's not that there's been a significant increase according to the Arbor data anyway. From 2022 until now, it's pretty consistent. I think we're just seeing this for this particular group of data for the first time. So data has revealed that 18.4% of the students at schools that use the system were internally excluded at least once. In 24 to 25. So I feel like this is going to turn into another discussion about, is putting kids in a room that's not their regular classroom deep life altering trauma or not? Because my answer is no.
I think you're right, yeah. It is going to turn into that discussion because there's not much more to say. You can't argue with the data necessarily. You can't say that schools not using Arbor aren't using internal exclusions as well. And obviously, you know, Yasmin, you have a different perspective on this, which would be interesting to hear about. From my perspective, I think that the slant on this that's given by the media and by commentators is that schools are very quick to internally exclude, that it's just something that they do to make their lives easier. And I think there's often a lack of consideration for the effect of behaviour on lessons, on learning, and on the safety or happiness of other pupils. And I think that that's often forgotten about. I've never seen anybody excluded, you know, or sent to what we used to have the recovery room unfairly. I have not seen it where I've thought, good grief, that's outrageous, that child didn't do anything wrong. That might be different in other schools, I don't know. We had plenty of bad behaviour at the school I was in, and that was the only way you could deal with it, because you have to, your aim is you have a lesson that you've planned, that you need all the students, all the children to come out of that lesson having learnt to the best of their ability what they can from that lesson. And when you can't do that because of behaviour problems and interruptions, whether it's low-level behaviour, whether it's, you know, really extreme behaviour, something has to be done about that. There's very little now in terms of sanction that the schools have. So you can say, right, you're going to have a detention. And when I was at school, you lived in fear of a detention because you were going to get such a telling off from your parents. Whereas now parents will contact schools and say, how dare you put my child in detention? They didn't do anything wrong, and obviously they'll minimise the story. You know, you always get that I was only moving the chair, and you're like, you were wielding it above your head and shouting that you were going to throw it. But yes, and so those kind of situations, you've got two sides of the story. And in the past, if, had I been that student, my parents would have said, you do not pick up a chair, not believing you go to your detention, you apologise to the teacher, blah, blah, blah. Nowadays, it's a different take on it, isn't it?
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Teachers, have you heard of Bet UK 2026? It's the world's biggest education and technology event, and it's completely free for educators. From keynote speakers and panel sessions to CPD accredited workshops and networking, Bet UK 2026 is where educators from across the globe come together to share ideas, spark inspiration, and find solutions that fuel our mission to drive better education globally. Get your free ticket today at betshow.com.
Hey teachers, it's Tom here from Teachers Talk Radio, just dropping in to tell you about Teachers Talk Connect 2026. We are back with our amazing big annual CPD and networking extravaganza in Manchester. It's on Saturday, the 14th of March, and tickets are completely free for teachers. Just head over to ttradio.org/Connect 2026 to grab your ticket today. We can't wait to see you there.
What I don't understand, right? I was thinking about this the other day. I was like, the way some people talk, and it's not just parents, the way some people talk, a detention is the worst part. Like, do they think, is this Guantanamo Bay? Like, what do they think this is? Are we torturing these kids? Are we hanging them from the ceiling? Like, it's a detention, for God's sake. You sit on a chair for half an hour or an hour after school and then you go home. No one dies. I genuinely don't understand why detentions, after school detention, Saturdays, there's an argument. After school detentions, even break time or lunchtime, there's an argument, because that's like, kids need an outlet, right? You need to, like, I get the arguments for that. I think sometimes the importance of removing kids from social chaos is more important, but there's an argument to be made there about break time, lunchtime, or Saturday. After school detentions for 35 minutes or 50 minutes or whatever it is, what are you complaining about? Like, if this is your biggest problem in life, or this is the biggest setback your child is going to face, you are so lucky and blessed. And if you think that this is too big a consequence for your child's misbehavior, ooh, God help your kid. How are detentions?
At my school, for many kids, they had to take the bus. We had about at least 30 buses that came in and took the kids home every night to remote villages. You can't walk to most of these places. And so it is a big inconvenience for parents. But the thing is, in the past, that would have been, the parents telling the child, you have caused me a huge inconvenience. And now it tends to be the school have caused me a huge inconvenience. Now, I'm a parent, so I'm not saying that parents are bad people. And I think that it's absolutely right if you feel that your child doesn't deserve a detention, of course you should go into the school. But it seems to have been the default, and kids don't turn up for them. I mean, kids just do not turn up for detentions. You'd have 30 kids down on a list for a Friday night detention. It was the principal's detention, and there'd be sort of 5 or 6 there, and there'd be no repercussions. So there's no repercussions from that. So then the behaviour carries on, and of course what happens is there's no point saying you'll get a detention if you carry this behaviour on in the classroom. So you have to remove them from the classroom. And the most extreme that you can do in a school, other than permanent exclusion, has become the last line of the only line of defence that we have to get somebody out of the classroom where they are causing complete chaos or disruption to the learning of others or to the safety of others. And now it seems that there's a sort of a media story that's sort of constantly going on about these exclusions, as though it's just done because we don't like the kids and we want to make our lives easier. But
because we all hate children. That's why we've been doing this for decades, because we hate them.
It does feel sometimes as though that's the narrative, isn't it? That feels like the prevailing narrative now, that teachers are doing it for their own convenience, and it couldn't possibly be just because that lesson has to be taught. Those students have to learn and they can't. Yasmin, do you have anything to say?
I have a lot to say. I have huge issues with internal exclusions. I will say, though, before I get into that, I like, just off the back of what you've both said there, I've said so many times, I feel like the media, as in mainstream media, a huge hand in this kind of negativity and scrutiny that schools face for a really normal part of their policies and their ability to run. Things like having detentions. If you can be on a news article because your child there's been a behavior policy that's been enforced, and your child has been picked up as a child that isn't following that behavior policy, things like shoes or incorrect uniform and things like that. If you can make it into mainstream news for that reason, then why wouldn't other people also have complaints, aimed at, I have a huge issue with the way or the kinds of things about schools that make it into the news. But in terms of internal exclusions, I would say that I do feel like they can be quite unregulated. And I've got an issue with the fact that, yes, schools keep the data. I can't imagine there's any school that doesn't know exactly which children have been in their internal exclusion and when, and that they don't keep meticulous records. There is no point anywhere in a school where a child isn't kind of registered or marked, or the school aren't aware of where they are. But I do feel like, for me, I think, again, I've said loads of times on the show, I think of all children on like a bell curve. The overwhelming majority in any school population will overwhelmingly get things right. And, I think when you apply any level of sanction on those pupils, they will often reflect and learn from their mistake. And all of that, preserves the integrity of school behavior policies. It preserves your culture. It teaches children that actions have consequences. You're rewarded for your good decisions and you are sanctioned for your bad ones. And, generally speaking, it's okay. But on the ends of the bell curve, you're going to have these children who maybe, some have undiagnosed needs, or even if they don't have undiagnosed needs, maybe because that will be a small number of pupils in your school, like in the wider context, it might be a child who's had an emergency. It might not be a chronic situation, but they might have experienced something really difficult. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have kids who don't actually have any serious reason. They've just decided to make bad decisions because they wanted to. But then amongst those two groups, you will often find that they are the children, in my experience anyway, amongst those groups is often the case that you'll find that you often end up with the same children in internal exclusion again and again and again. And I've always viewed exclusion as being on like a continuum. Being sent out of your classroom to me is a form of exclusion. Whether or not it was necessary for me is, it's another thread in this conversation, but, it's a form of exclusion. It's a form of rejection. And so is internal exclusion to me. Now, in the article, it said something about how it shouldn't be the first thing that happens, something else should happen first. But I disagree with that. There are times where it's absolutely necessary and it actually preserves the safety of children. Say you've had a really bad fight in the playground, you're on lunch duty, you need to investigate, you need to write statements, you need to gather what's happened in a way that's fair, and you need to gather the facts and find out what's going to happen. I don't think in a case like that, it makes sense to be like, okay, back to your lessons now, we're going to deal with this later, just so that we, have shown that we've escalated this from the lowest level and then moved it further up. In a case like that, going to an internal exclusion room makes complete sense, So I think there are many, many cases where, there's so many different behavior situations I've seen in schools where children do kind of need that reset. But I think for me, the kids that I really worry about are the ones that are there all the time, again and again and again. Like I've said loads of times, I just don't feel like there are enough preventative behavior management strategies in schools. I don't want to make this conversation about children have unmet needs, because there are loads of children that don't. However, I do feel like all children benefit from preventative behavior management strategies if there is a lot of evidence to show that they're not able to manage the school's rules, you know, and I don't feel like you have to necessarily have a medical reason or like a disability to fall into that category. I just don't think there are enough behavior management strategies. There are things like reports. I still see the same reports that I saw when I was at school. I think in so many ways, schools have come really far. There are so many things that are so much better in schools, but how come the preventative behavior management strategies in many ways are still exactly the same? Like, have any of you as teachers ever felt like that report where you get like 3 ticks, you've got 3 targets, which often aren't even really written in a productive way? Things like, I will not talk. Like, that's not really a target. That's not a target. When we're observing a teacher, when we're giving them EBIs or we're giving feedback, we don't write things like, you know, your target is, you know, you won't write something like your target is you're not going to not circulate. You're not going to write something like that. You're going to write more circulation, or do you know what I mean? The targets a lot of the time aren't even like neutral or positive. They're quite negative. Like whenever I'm teaching, I always try to use really I use very particular language. So I won't say things like, you know, stop talking. I will normally say something like, I want you to turn around and face the board. I want you to turn around and face the front. Like, it's just, I focus on what I want you to do and not what I don't want you to do. Whereas with with children, we often don't do that. And I've always found that a little bit weird. And I mean, there are times where I've had children who, for whatever reason, in my classroom just aren't getting it right. They're interrupting the lesson. They might not be arriving on time. They're just not following my instructions. Yes, I will always follow the behavior policy in any school that I'm in. I think it's really dangerous if teachers don't do that. I think you have to follow the behavior policies of a school that you're in. And if you don't like the policies in your school, then either raise it or go to another school. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think, like I said, if a school is really high performing or they're really strict and they've got zero tolerance policies, I'm not necessarily against that. If a school is completely trauma informed, I'm not necessarily against that. Like, wherever I am, I will be what it is that the school needs me to be. I think that's really important, that as a teacher, you uphold the policies in your school. But anyway, whenever I have a class of children, if I've got kids who just aren't able to manage the expectations in my classroom, I don't see putting strategies in place to support them as lowering expectations, which I think a lot of people argue is the case. I just feel like it's kind of removing the hurdles so that they are able to reach the same high expectations as other children. And I don't feel like I ever need to rely on a background reason. Like, that's what I see trauma-informed practice as. If you treat all children with the same kind of consideration and context that you would treat a child with maybe a medical reason or like a disability, then I feel like it improves the well-being and the attainment and outcomes and the sense of belonging that all children have. Like, that's just how I feel.
Even if you don't agree with trauma-informed practice isn't a thing, we don't do that here. Okay, fine. But if you have those same kids that are in that internal exclusion multiple times every week, it's not working for them. Like, I don't understand how anyone can look at those kids that you said on the end of the bell curve that are constantly being put in internal seclusion, like, and not recognize that that's not effective. Like, no matter what your view on different behavior policies is, like, clearly that is not working for those students. So I do feel like there's, in terms of those students, there's a strong case where, well, this is ridiculous, and it's certainly not having a positive effect, so it's quite likely having a negative one. But in terms of the other students, I don't know. Sorry, Lucy, what were you going to say?
Oh, well, no, I mean, I was going to say a couple of things. Firstly, I am going to just mention Hachette Learning again, our sponsors, just to say that the show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So visit hachetteLearning.com to explore the full range of titles. But what I was going to say is that Yasmin really touched on a point there that I think should be expanded. It is that prevention side of things, when you can see and you can tell very early on from year 7, for example, in my experience of secondary school, you can tell who the kids are that are going to be pose the problems in years 8, 9, and do you get what I mean? You can generally tell because those behaviours, the traits are already there. And I wonder whether we should be looking at investing early on in behaviour management of some sort from the start, some sort of activity. I led on maths intervention, so we could tell the students who were going to struggle with their maths learning, and so we would take them out of some lessons once a week to work in a small group and do maths. And maybe we need to look at something like that in terms of sort of positive behavior learning, listening to them. What's your experience of school? How is school going for you? Don't take them out of things like break and lunch and things that they want to, obviously, that they need as well. But I do think sometimes there is some value in nipping things in the bud before they grow. And if those students then feel supported in school, you may find that those escalating behaviours are less extreme. They may still not be perfect students, but you may find that you're just able to keep a lid on some of the sort of worsening behaviours that develop as they get older. And so do we have anything like that in schools? Well, there are behaviour hubs in some schools. I remember, I've spoken about it before, a school that had an exclusion school within the school itself, and students of all ages went to this place, and all they wanted to do was go back to the mainstream school. Now, the school within the site, they were cared for, they were supported, they had lessons, they had dedicated teachers within that who took them for all their classes. But they knew that the aim always was to get them back into mainstream school. And I think it was on one of the educating sort of counties kind of programs. And I just remember thinking, what an amazing idea, because the aspiration was for those kids to go back to their friends in the main school. And they knew that they had targets to meet, and they knew that if they went back and messed around, then they'd be back out again. But it kept them within the school boundaries. It kept them cared for. They had lessons, not just a worksheet that they've got to do on their own in a cold, horrible room with no talking. They had lessons. But maybe we need to look at something like that as a more standard approach. And before we have a falling school roll, we should start to have space to incorporate that in existing building provision. I don't know, it's just an idea.
I was going to say, which you touched on there, there's been a massive rise in internal provisions within mainstream schools. And in many ways, I really like them. I think it's something that all schools should have. There's been a huge rise over the last even maybe decade or last 5 years post-COVID. So many more schools now have an internal AP, alternative provision, within their school, which I think for so many reasons is really nice, because it's like a sense of belonging. The children are still in the same uniform. They might be running on a different timetable. They're exposed to less students and less staff and things like that in the school, but they're still very much part of the school. And, they can sustain a lot of the friendships they had before in the school. But I just think, for me, a lot of behavior in mainstream, or a lot of the way it's managed, is just reactionary. I think it's really sink or swim for both staff and teachers. There's cursory judgments made of teachers as well in terms of how good they are at behavior management based on what's observed of their lessons. Even, maybe senior leaders or other teachers walking by. I'm pretty sure if you ask any head of department, whether they're quiet about it or not, they will have a list in their head of who they see as having strong behavior management and who they don't.
Yeah.
And it might not even be based on actual formal observations. It might just be based on cursory judgment and assessments of this teacher, when sometimes you can have a really bad year as a teacher in terms of behavior management because of your class lists and the classes you have. It's just a fact that some classes are more challenging than others. And then you might other times have, a really good year because a lot of the classes you had happen to be a lot easier to manage, or maybe even smaller. There's so many different factors. And it's the same with children. I feel like it's really reactionary, where it's so like sink or swim. You'll just wait to see who isn't getting it right. And then they end up escalated through every level of the behavior system. And then sometimes schools just get to say, we've done this, we've exhausted that, we've done this. But to me, like I've done exclusions for a really long time. And what I mean by done exclusions is, since I was a teenager, like I grew up on a council estate. I used to represent a lot of my neighbours and just people I knew in their exclusions. Basically, I just used to go to school and argue with head teachers. And then, when I got older, I became a teacher. And then I saw, a different perspective and a different side to things. And then now for the last couple of school years, I've been a governor at a really high performing school. And I actually sit on the other side now, where sometimes I have to co-sign a decision to permanently exclude a child. And I think one thing that has really, really stood out to me, especially since becoming a governor, I think sometimes a lot of these really, really high performing schools and academies with a lot of money are actually the schools who invest the most in external services and like offers to put in interventions and preventative behavior management strategies to support their children who are struggling the most. That's just what I've seen in a lot of the schools that I've been connected to, have been working in, or have friends at those schools, or just know some way or another. That has really stood out to me in the last couple of years. I think some of the really, really high performing schools that get some of the best outcomes also often have the best SEND outcomes, the best PA for their SEND pupils, often have the best, just a lot of like really good outcomes. Obviously PA isn't the only thing that a child needs or gains from school, but it's extremely important. Do you know what I mean? Like their outcomes are very, very important. And that's something that just really stands out to me. It's something that I feel like isn't particularly well known about a lot of these top performing schools, is they actually spend some of their money on thinking outside the box and putting interventions in place rather than just escalating a child through the same things again and again, because they recognize the impact it has, not just on the child, and not just on their staff, but also on the behavior and culture in the wider school, for everyone to see that this child is just constantly in trouble, just constantly not getting it right. And that's something that, it's really stood out to me. It wasn't something I would have really believed or been aware of even 5 years ago.
Yeah, my previous school spent a lot of money doing that. It was an all-girls school, and so we had a lot of events and a lot of outside people coming in for workshops and stuff, and a lot of those were centered around basically, I mean, not that it was ever said in these words, but like preventing these girls from getting some gang member boyfriends and having 15 kids before they were 20. That was kind of the goal. Like, have a life goal. You can do many things. Have some self-esteem and self-respect. Different ways of kind of building that up so they actually could find their own path in life. And that would have, and it was very like, it wasn't about behavior in school. It was very focused on like them developing their self-belief and having some sort of long-term goal for themselves, and then that then as a result filtered down into them seeing school as important, them actually aiming for things in the future for themselves, them taking school more seriously, them not getting into fights at break time, not disrupting lessons. Like it all kind of, it wasn't focused on improving their behavior. It was focused on them improving their own life chances, which then had an impact on their behavior because they were making better decisions. And I feel like a lot of students would benefit from that, especially with the rampant apathy that we see nowadays. I feel like if a lot of these students felt more confident, if they liked themselves better and thought that they were capable of achieving something in life more, then they would take school more seriously and they would want better for themselves and they would make better choices. And it would just kind of naturally filter down.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think another concern is that as we hear the story that we spoke about first, the behaviour. That was a primary school. That was 2 primary schools where the teachers were striking because of the behaviour, the violence. I mean, it was actually described as violent behaviour amongst primary school pupils, as a primary school pupil bringing a knife into school. And I think we have to be very mindful that those young people who are coming through to secondary schools, it sounds as though the conveyor belt of people that come through the system are coming in at a higher level of behaviour issue, increasingly. Do you see what I mean? So year on year, I mean, I remember a local primary school here, you know, a teacher telling me about some of the physical attacks that she'd sustained, you know, so, but it seems to be more and more common now. And I think the concern is, I think that if we want a long-term solution, then I think that we have to work on an entire sort of chain of events that starts from very, very early in school. And I don't know enough about primary school now. I have worked in primary education to know how that looks and how that works. And I've certainly not worked in it where violence and that kind of behaviour was fairly regular and possibly becoming almost a standard behaviour. And I think that in order to, because when they get bigger, when they're small and you can pick them up and you can lift them off other children if they're attacking, that's one thing. But by the time they get to secondary school, I think those problems are going to be even greater. So this isn't something that, you know, when we talk about internal exclusions and how they're being used just to make it easy for the teacher, etc. I think that we have to recognise if we don't counter those stories and really get that understanding out in the media, through the media, that this isn't the case. Things like Educating the Counties programmes, they have opened or shone a light on some of the problems that we encounter. But I just worry that if this narrative doesn't stop, then as challenges become more and more pressing, we will just lose more and more teachers. That will be the end result of it. So that's my fear. That's my concern over it.
One thing I find interesting, though, is how the mass exodus of teachers is often it's attributed to pupil behavior a lot of the time. And the one thing that always gets me is why no one actually talks about staff behavior, because I feel like a lot of people leave because of other teachers and not just because of students. But I think that's a story for another day.
That's an interesting point. It's true, I think. Ray's rubbing her hands. Well, should we finish there then?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope you found the discussion useful.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.